Hey everybody, welcome, and thank you for coming out today in this early spring day and the first day of March Madness. My wife went to Duke, so I'm of course ready to go and excited to be following the tournament the next few, hopefully more than the next few days, but welcome everybody. I'm Simon Rosenberg from NDN, and this is an exciting event for us. Morley, Winograd, and Mike Hayes are here today in one of the first stops of a tour to promote their new book. I'm so sorry, not new book, their old book with a new chapter. Here it is, Millennial Makeover. And it was named one of the 10 top books of the year by the chief book review critic of the New York Times. And it is a wonderful and thoughtful, prescient book, and we are proud to be helping them on their tour around the country. We'll be doing events with them in New York and Boston, LA, and San Francisco in the next few months. For those of you watching online who may, in one of those cities, hopefully we'll be able to see you in person. And it is a book that is very consistent with a big argument that we've been making here at NDN for the last several years, which is that a new politics was emerging in America. That three great changes happening in the life of the United States was birthing a new and different politics of the 21st century, and that those three things are the emergence of a new demography, a new American people, the way that media, first, new demography, second is a whole new media and technology environment that's fundamentally changing the way that we communicate and advocate and organize our politics. And third is obviously new governing challenges that are very 21st century in nature. And this simple story that we've been telling for the last few years is, since really back in 2005, prior to the rise of a guy, that skinny kid from Chicago that nobody had ever heard of, who's now President of the United States, clearly I think when we look back at the last few years and begin to look forward, it is clear that one political era has come to an end in America. And whether it was the conservative era or the 20th century or whatever these ways we could describe what came before, that there was an old, as Barack calls it, an old politics, and that it's now giving way to a new politics. That doesn't mean, though, that a switch is flipped, right? I mean, just like in any city, there are old buildings and new buildings side by side, that I think what we're seeing now in the early days, and Morley and Mike are going to talk about this quite a bit today, is that we're seeing only the beginning of what will be a 20 to 30 year emergence of a new politics. And Morley and Mike have written what may be the definitive book, really looking at what that kind of political era could look like, what its characteristics are. And what they argue, which is also consistent with which is why we work together so well, consistent with something we've been saying, which is that driving a lot of this will be demography. I posit to all of you that America is going through what may be its most profound demographic transformation in all of its history since the arrival of the Europeans here in the 15th and 16th century. We've seen just in my lifetime the country go from 11%, when I was born, the country was 88.5% white and 11% African American, and today we're 66% white or Anglo and 33% other. A tripling of the minority population in the country in just 40 years. This has been driven largely through the Immigration Act of 1965, which changed the immigration targets for the United States away from the Europeans, which had been our preferred immigrants for hundreds of years, to Latin Americans and Asians and Africans. And we're seeing a physical change of who we are as a people that's more dramatic, I believe, than any time, again, since the time of the arrival of the Europeans here. But what's also happening as we enter the 21st century, and so when you look at this 21st century electorate and people in the United States, one big change is going to be this immigrant group, largely Hispanic, but also other, right? That really wasn't here in the 20th century politics. But the other big group, and it's related to the first, is the millennial generation, the largest generation in all of American history. And what's important to recognize about that, and I'll let Morley and Mike do the rest here, is that we cannot view young people as young people. These guys are not sitting at the kids' table, right? This is not, youth politics is pejorative traditionally when you talk about politics. And the truth is that getting on the right side of the largest generation in American history is maybe the largest strategic imperative for both political parties and both ideological movements of all the strategic imperatives that exist today in American politics. So this is no small deal. This is not the kids' table. This is mission critical, mission number one for those who are in the game and trying to play it out. Is how do you imagine, what your politics is going to look like? Because if you can't win the millennials, who are going to dominate 21st century politics the way that the boomers dominated 20th century politics, right? Late 20th century politics. If you can't win millennials, you can't be a majority party in the United States. So this is no small matter we're going to be talking about today. This really is, I think, front and center to all that we will know about American politics over the next 20, 30 years. And what's great is that with us today are two people who saw this before most and know more about this than virtually anybody I've spoken to, and who also are great communicators, I think, about the strategic opportunity and challenge of this new emerging generation. So please join me in welcoming Morley, Winograd, and Mike Hayes, our two fellows at NDN, and we're going to start with Morley. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks for those kind words, and thank you all for being here. We had no slides moving, so what do I need to do? Probably turn it on first. There we go. Okay. We wrote this book, as Simon said, that came out in early '08 about the changes that millennials would drive in American politics. And then the election happened pretty much in alignment with what we said in the book. And our editor asked us to do a afterword for a paperback edition that is now out. And we sort of take about 9,000 words in that afterward to say we told you so. So I don't know how exciting the chapter is, but it is an attempt to look at why Obama won and what kind of lessons one might derive from that outcome that are important not just for politicians and political campaigns where a lot of the focus is, but for governing America and leading America. If you listen to the Republican Party's explanation of the 2008 election, it generally says, well, everything was fine, and then the stock market crashed, and McCain fell behind, and that was the end of it. And that election reminds me of somebody who, when asked, why is it daylight outside, said the sun came up. I mean, yeah, it's obviously part of the answer, and it may be a good surface answer, but it fails to even begin to describe what was actually going on and why that meltdown of Wall Street, the week that Wall Street died, is the way Wall Street Journal captures it, September 15th all the way through the 18th, 19th of September. Why did that have the impact on the electorate that it did, and why was the election already headed in a direction of victory for Obama that event sort of just underlined? And our answer in the afterword is, of course, that that week was the triggering event for the next civic era of America. And we had talked earlier in realignment theory about how every 40 years or so, America changes its political allegiances in terms of majority support for a particular party. And when we started, we used to have a question mark over there on '08. Now we can put the first blue bar up of what we suspect will be many. But when we talked about that, we said that you need some kind of crisis, some kind of significant external event in order to break the dam that is holding back the forces of change that are building before a realignment occurs. And in this particular case, that week was that triggering event. But what happens is that most people spend all their time, as the Republicans are doing, talking about the triggering event instead of the underlying trends of what actually is going on. It's sort of like the dam broke. Yeah, but there was a lot of water behind the dam, and it's now flooded everything. And what's this water all about? It's kind of important to understand that. And what we said in our basic theory of the book was that these realignments occur every 40 years as a result of a rise of a large new civic generation, very dynamic, not always a civic generation, a large dynamic generation, and a new communication technology that allows them to be mobilized almost without understanding by the rest of the country who may or may not be involved in that communication technology. Obviously, it's no big insight to say now that in 2008, That was the millennial generation, those 27 and under, who voted for President Obama 2-1, and the social networks that they used to mobilize themselves. Back when we wrote the book, we could say that by saying MySpace, YouTube. These days you'd have to say Facebook, Twitter, and God knows what else. But it's all the same idea. It's a different way of communicating peer-to-peer, not top-down, not broadcast, not controlled messaging. And in this case, as in previous realignments, those changes cause significant differences in electoral results, which we've already seen, voting behavior, which we've already seen, and public policy, which we're just about to see. So people say, well, so what's going to happen? So first thing we would do is recommend you read your history books. We spend some time capturing some of that in our book, but obviously there's more to be said. This is actually the fourth. We are now living through the fourth civic realignment in American history. My co-author, Mike Hayes, who is a political scientist, has a PhD to prove it. His contribution to the literature is really in this book, in the sense that while political realignment theory has been around for a while, nobody until Mike has clearly documented that there are really two different types of realignment, one civic-minded, one ideologically oriented, based upon the two different types of generations from Strauss and Howe's theories of generational cycles. And so even though it happens every 40 years, these civic generations only come around every 80 years. And so if you're looking for American history analogs, you would need to go back 80 years and then 80 years again to the days of FDR and Lincoln. They do, however, reflect very well what we're likely to see in the way of political debates going forward. The problem everybody has right now, at least not everybody, but many people have, in trying to understand when history is happening right in front of you, is the analogs they reach for are either Reagan or, in some more insightful cases, the Nixon realignment of 1968. And say, so see, this is how it went. Well, yes, that is how that idealist era realignment went. It has very little to do with civic era realignments. And there is very little polling data that extends prior to 1964, 1968. And most of the methodologies before that weren't so great. So a lot of the polling data that does exist is somewhat suspect. And so you'll see a lot of polling results analyzed over a 40-year time frame, which is all inside a previous ideological era, not a civic era. So without polls, but with some historical analogies, there are still lessons to be learned from this civic era. What you need to realize is the challenges are almost identical between the challenges that FDR and Lincoln faced. They took their political parties out of an electoral wilderness. In Lincoln's case, the very first time his political party won a national election, hadn't been around long enough to win many others. They were obviously in the middle of some of the worst crises the country's ever faced. I know there's a lot of conversation now about how bad the economy is. I like to call it the Great Recession to make sure people know it isn't a depression, but it's bad. And as a consequence of being given that crisis to deal with, they actually significantly revitalized and expanded national political institutions. So America in 1868 had very little resemblance to the America of 1848. The America of 1940 bore almost no relationship in how our economy was organized, the role of the federal government, the nature of population and work and life as compared to 1920. And when President Obama finishes his second term in 2016, this country will look nothing like the America of 1996 that we're so familiar with, because you have this complete generational and technological change that will change our politics, among many, many other things. By the way, if you're wondering about current events at all in this context, the latest political surveys from Pew on millennials show that they support the Obama administration's economic program, 54-39, and 63-29. And when asked whether there should be more government control over the economy or a smaller government, millennials are in favor of more government control over the economy by a 54 to 39% margin. So you have these kinds of current debates about where things ought to go, but the millennials are as solidly supportive of the president's policies as they were of his campaign. Okay, one last thing on FDR and Lincoln, then we'll get to the 2008 election. It is, if you read the history books, eerie as to how much of a similarity there is between the political commentary of today and the political commentary of those days. When not yet President Lincoln in 1856 ran for office, he talked in the campaign at one point about the impossibility of a country that was half slave and half free existing. And his campaign advisors pulled him aside and said, don't use that line. You'll sound like an agitator who's trying to dissolve the Union. So, pull back from that rhetoric and that sort of futuristic, apocalyptic vision. And he did for a couple years. And then in 1858, when he entered the historic debates with Senator Douglas, I always go Stevens, it's Stephen Douglas. When he entered into the debates with Senator Douglas, he told his same campaign advisors, back then they wouldn't have been called campaign advisors, that he had settled on the main argument he was going to make in those debates, and it was that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And they all said, "What, are you crazy? I mean, you'll never win. You'll never win." Well, of course, he did not win that campaign, but he did win the debate. He did win the presidency. One advisor told him, if you use that line, I don't think you should. You'll probably be president of the United States. And so it was that ability to express a vision of the future and stick to it that made him one of our greatest, if not the greatest presidents. And of course, many of you may not know that when FDR articulated a New Deal for the Forgotten Man, it was roundly opposed by most of the Democrats of that era as inciting class warfare. Where have we heard those lines before, right? And so you hear conversations about Obama's trying to do too much, the budget blueprint is overly ambitious, et cetera, et cetera. And all we look at and say is, yes, and in 8 years when America is completely different, people will go back to that blueprint and say, here's where it all started, a new era of responsibility. So those are the historical analogies we can give you. The campaign analogy that we think is relevant to governing goes to something that we call in the book the 4 M's of politics, which are message, messenger, media, and money, that working synergistically together create a campaign and a winning campaign. And in the book, we try and explain how far off a civic era set of 4 M's the Republicans allowed themselves to get, and how interestingly early Obama was in adopting this civic era set of 4 M's. So I'm going to let Mike do most of this, but let me just take you through message, and then we'll show you where that goes and how it leads to the population. So first of all, the message that Obama was delivering, as you all know, was unity and hope. And the message from the Republicans, which had worked successfully for 40 years, was division and fear. And every time the campaign sort of went off in a direction that the Republicans didn't like, they'd try and come up with some new division and fear message in the hopes that it would work. And it never took, and they couldn't understand why. If they had read the results of the 2006 election, in many congressional districts, that same strategy failed where it had worked before. It certainly didn't work in 2008, and that's because it's an ideological or idealist era message. It's not a civic era message. What civic era messages are about are getting rid of the divisive personal morality and culture of the prior years. So the rebellion is not against institutions, as some of you boomers may have remembered. It's against the culture and a desire to have a more unified culture, which post-campaign, not in the campaign, Obama has called the era of responsibility, and that's as good a name as any for something that's more about mutual concern as opposed to greed and individualism. But greed and individualism are popular in ideological eras. They just don't work in civic eras. And when the civic era arrived with the collapse of Wall Street, the message was way off course for the Republicans. They couldn't get back. The other thing that happens in civic eras is that there's a great deal of focus on economics and economic inequality in particular. The idea of social issues, which is one piece of a divisive and fear message. You pick the name of the issue, whether it's on the social issue side, whether you're trying to divide people around immigration questions, as the Republicans thought they would in 2008, or in abortion or other kinds of debates of that kind. They don't work in civic eras. Prohibition was repealed within the first year of FDR's administration. The wet-dry debate that kept the Democrats from nominating a candidate for 120 ballots in the 1920s disappeared. And basically because, as the people booing Herbert Hoover at the opening day of the ball game said, we want beer. I mean, it's a tough economic environment, and you're just not interested in those kinds of lesser level questions. So what happens in civic eras is that the primacy of the federal government is enhanced over states' rights and to some degree over individual rights. There's a great deal of direction, strong direction from Washington on what should be done, and you get the creation of new institutions. And I can tick off a few of the ones that the campaign foreshadowed and you're now seeing come into play. I suspect the biggest one ultimately in changing America will be national service. Yesterday, I think the House passed the significant increase in national service resources, but it's only the beginning of what will be a major effort, and in our opinion, will ultimately lead to mandatory national service as part of American society. But you'll also hear, again, not always focused upon, the conversations on education and how we need to reform American education. In civic eras, educational reform has been a central part of the political agenda. Lincoln's Moral Act in Lincoln's day established land-grant colleges. The GI Bill after World War II, those are always doing that. And then you also get a shift. So those are a couple institutions, a couple others you can talk about. The National Net Roots Organization, driven from Washington, is potentially another. Here's a poll from October of 2008 in comparison to 81 and 91 on what people are looking for in civic eras. You have this gigantic rise from 18% in 81 to 45% by October of 2008 on agreement that there is too little regulation of business. In fact, 3/4 of the people believe that lack of regulation caused the financial crisis, making any of the prior era's economic theories suspect and really no longer credible. And then finally, in civic eras on the message side, we've shown this slide before, but when Joe the plumber suggested that Obama was in favor of sharing the wealth and redistributing income and maybe a socialist, most of the country said, good. And it was a very popular economic message to have, and it will be in civic eras. Even today, the tax cuts and tax raises parts of the Obama budget are the most popular aspects of his proposals. And so you're going to get a lessening of economic inequality, which happens in every civic era, as a result of that popular support. And then, of course, the final stage of the campaign, McCain suggested that since Obama was doing well, the country was really in danger of electing a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, and that would be a really terrible thing. And most of the people, when asked, 59% of them said that would actually be a good thing. And so the notion that divided government is something the public wants is true in idealist eras. It is not true in civic eras, and it's the wrong argument to make. Basically, there wasn't a policy position or message position that the Republicans took in the 2008 campaign that wasn't based on an old playbook. Obama would call it old politics. We would call it idealist era politics, and it was all wrong for that particular campaign. But it wasn't just the message that carried the day, it was the other 3 M's as well. I think Mr. Hayes needs to get up here and talk to you about some of that. Although this is not meant to be a picture of President Obama.
Thank you, Morley. So the next portion, the next M of the four M's, is actually the messenger, and that is Barack Obama. One of the earliest things that we had, probably the only slight argument that we had with our publisher at the beginning when we were writing our book was, and she wisely told us, don't get involved in who's going to win the party nominations. I mean, it's hard to believe right now, but think back a year ago, and it was hardly a foregone conclusion as to who the Democratic nominee was. Earlier on, we thought it would be the Republicans who would have the most difficulty selecting a nominee. The Democrats, Hillary Clinton, would waltz through, and she would become very easily the nominee. Shows how these things can change. But the issue of who was going to get the party nominations didn't seem to be a particularly fruitful direction for us to go. And so our publisher told us, just don't get into that. And we really didn't very much, but we did in the very beginning of this book say, well, we know that the millennial generation is going to be the crucial generation, and we do think there is one candidate who does seem to have a possibility, a very strong possibility, probability, of resonating with this particular young generation, and that happens to be Barack Obama. And even as early as the summer of 2007, when much of the rest of the public didn't know who he was, the millennial generation did. And he had a pretty solid name identification with the millennials and about a 2-to-1 positive ratio of favorable to unfavorable attitudes among the millennials. So even as early as 2007, we were able to write, as we turned our book in on July 4th, 2007, that it did look like there was one candidate who had the potential of appealing to this generation. He recognized generational differences. He recognized the need for social and political unity, and he was clearly willing to use a new technology. And so while I can't say that we totally predicted there would be Barack Obama as a Democratic nominee, we went about as far out on the limb as our publisher was able to let us go. And we do have some data that really suggests that Barack Obama, in fact, as voters had a chance to look at him, by this time when we did this survey in September 2008, he was clearly had the strength, the ability, the characteristics of what voters look for in a civic era. So willing to break new ground. This is, the blue is people who say that best describes Obama, the red best describes John McCain. And you can see pretty much across the board, ability to, willingness to break new ground, able to communicate and mobilize public opinion, understands the needs of the American people, able to keep the economy and guide the economy, make America prosperous. All of those, Obama had a very large lead among the entire population, far more than that among millennials, who just clearly were overwhelmingly positive toward Obama. The only image at this point in this particular survey that McCain led in was very slightly, 2 or 3 percentage points on terrorism, keeping the country safe from terrorist attacks. But even on that issue, millennials actually preferred Obama. So very clearly, the Democrats in Barack Obama had the messenger who was going to speak to the needs of a new era, particularly to the needs of a new generation. The media was also obviously a clear area of success for Senator Obama, for now President Obama. But it isn't the first time that this has happened. In the previous 2 civic realignments, a new medium came along and was utilized by the winning candidate, was utilized by the winning party, and that candidate, that party, utilized their strengths in those areas with that new medium, each of the new media, to realign America for the following 40 years. So in 1860, it was the rise of the telegraph. Hard to think of that as new technology, but think of things in the 1860s and prior to that, when essentially it took days for people to go from one place to another. It was essentially as far as they could walk or a horse could ride in a day. That's how far news could get during that era. So the telegraph, which allowed for virtually instantaneous communication, was highly revolutionary at that point. And what this led to was the creation of partisan newspapers. In the 1860s through the early part of the 20th century, 90% of the newspapers in the country were affiliated with one political party or another. Don't see that much today because newspapers wanted to keep their wanted to be able to hopefully advertise to both Democrats and Republicans. But in the 1860s, when Abraham Lincoln was running, there were Democratic papers and there were Republican papers. And they captured, as Morley talked about, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that was captured in the Illinois papers explicitly with very great partisan coloration. There's a wonderful story that in one particular event, Abraham Lincoln is carried off the stage by his supporters. The Republican paper says it was a triumph. He was on the shoulders of his supporters. The Democratic paper said he had fainted dead away and his supporters had to drag him off the stage. But that was what Lincoln was able to use. It made Lincoln a national figure, and it allowed Lincoln and his party to basically eclipse the old political elites. In the 1930s, it was a new technology, and that was radio. Again, hard to think of it as new technology, but at that point it was. The number of people buying radio sets increased exponentially throughout the 1920s. Even in the 1930s, in the height of the Depression, people were adding radio sets, households, in the millions per year. So they needed radios, even if they couldn't afford anything else in a sense. They made sure that they had their radios. Every home had its radio receiver. And what this allowed Roosevelt to do, because of his great presence on the radio, the fireside chats, all of that sort of thing, was allowed him to go beyond the traditional media of that era, then the newspapers, the partisan press, which was a little less partisan but still pretty partisan, allowed him to go over the heads of the traditional media elites and speak directly to the American people. And we now are on the threshold of a new transfer to a new era of a new medium, and that is the social networking, internet-based social networking communication technology. A remarkable technology. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Obama, as you all know, dominated that area. But think about the complexity of this. First of all, it's uncontrolled. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people are able to communicate with one another without going through any sort of central filtering, without any sort of central messaging. It is remarkably complex, and it allowed President Obama, because he was one of the early people to understand this, allowed him to communicate very directly with voters, bypassing, again, the traditional media, bypassing the traditional kind of messaging that one would see on the media, and to reach people directly, to get his message out, and also to raise money in large sums. So the internet has now become a thoroughly dominant force, or is on the verge of becoming a thoroughly dominant force, I would say. This particular chart was from Pew Research last year, asking people how they got information about the campaign. TV was still the chief, most important device, medium and platform for that. 72% said they got information from television. But by now, a third said they used the internet to get information. The internet had actually eclipsed newspapers and radio as recently as last year. And what's most important is if you look at the bullet points, the number citing the media had tripled since 2004. Half of the millennials, so while only a third of the general public said they used the internet, half of the millennials used the internet. So that meant that the general public, other than millennials, was somewhere down in the 20%. So it was a clearly dominant way of millennials getting political information. And finally, I think most important, a majority of millennials, about 60%, said the internet was their favorite platform. They might have used TV, some of them might even used radio and newspapers, although not many, but certainly millennials were using TV, but they were definitely using the internet. They definitely liked the internet. That was their favorite way of getting of obtaining political communication, getting political information. And you can see that given the change in this area, how this is going to go in the future. It's only going to increase the importance of the internet even more. One of the ways that we can actually demonstrate how the importance of the internet, but also how well Barack Obama utilized the internet, was with what was developed by a company called Spartan Research. And they developed what they call the SIP index, SIPP, which, if you can see, stands for Spartan Internet Political Performance Index. Having done a lot of work for most of the last 20-odd years in my life in television, I can tell you a little bit about TV ratings. And what you try to do is you put a box in somebody's home, or in the old days, you actually had a diary that they tried to fill out. And it's really, in some ways, not very complicated. It was complicated to try to get people to watch, but the measurement techniques were fairly straightforward because you only had one or two questions to answer. Either the set's on or it's off. Somebody's watching, they're not watching a channel. That's really pretty much the only questions you have. With the internet, it's far more complex. And so what the Spartan company was able to do was take an algorithm looking at about 650 different measures, because you can contact people in so many different ways. They can contact campaigns through going to news websites, campaign websites, blogs. There's just any number of ways that this particular medium works. And the SIP index tried to measure the impact of all of these particular ways in which the campaigns could communicate. It's somewhat weighted so that something like communicating with the campaign was actually given more weight than just going to a search engine and looking up Barack Obama, for example. But nevertheless, all of these things matter. You're only seeing a portion of this. This is the kind of the primary election campaign, and it's the share of contacts that particular candidate had on the medium. I chose 4 candidates, but there really would be many more, of course, at that particular stage. The red line is Obama. You can see his share increased. It was high from the very beginning. As early as July 2007, he was getting 20% of the internet contacts. By the time it all ended, at the end of the primary campaign, when he won the nomination, it was close to 40% of the internet contacts of all types were Barack Obama's. Actually, the candidate who did the best, other than Obama, was Ron Paul, the Libertarian Republican candidate, which only goes to speak to the importance of that it's not only the medium that makes a difference, but it's also the message and the messenger. And Paul did not have the proper message and the proper persona to appeal to the millennial generation. You see that Hillary eventually made some gains, eventually toward the end of the campaign bypassed Ron Paul, but never got close to Obama. And finally, just for comparison, John McCain never got into the ball game really in any meaningful way. Even at the very end, when he had already clinched the nomination by June of 2008, had only got about a 15 share. And the same thing persisted during the general election campaign. Essentially, even though McCain made a few gains toward the end, essentially Obama was getting about 2/3 of the internet share and McCain about 1/3 by the end of the campaign. So total domination by Obama from beginning to end of the new medium. And that helped Obama to dominate the money raising. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the blue bars represent how much money Obama, Clinton, and McCain raised in the primary campaign. The red bars above that were in the general election campaign after the primary. And you can see again from beginning to end, Obama, using the internet and as well as other more traditional means, was able to dominate the fourth M, the money M of this election campaign as well. So the end result was that obviously Barack Obama won, but it was the sharpest generational divisions that we have seen in American history, probably at least since I would guess the New Deal. Although, as Morley mentioned, we didn't have political polling in that era, so we don't really know exactly what the GI generation, the last civic generation, how they voted. We're pretty sure they were overwhelmingly pro-Franklin Roosevelt, but at what levels we don't know. But you can see that Barack Obama carried the millennial vote, 18 to 29-year-olds, by about a 2-to-1 margin. The next oldest generation, the Generation X, was about evenly divided, and their traditional form, the baby boomers, were exactly evenly divided. And finally, the oldest people, 65 and older, the silent generation, actually gave a majority of their votes for John McCain. But the key number is that millennial generation with that 2-to-1 majority for Barack Obama. What's most important is this is not going to be a temporary phenomenon. This isn't just simply something that happened in 2008 or something that's only Barack Obama. This is, in fact, long-lasting. This chart represents party identification of young voters. And as Simon pointed out, young voters are not the same in every era and all times. In 2002, 18 to 29-year-olds actually were about evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. Most of those, virtually all of those young voters were actually members of Generation X, which is kind of the Ronald Reagan Republican generation. And you can see that they gave the Republicans, if anything, an insignificant 2-point lead. By 2004, as millennials first started to join the electorate in some numbers, the Democrats went up 37 to 34, still evenly divided, but going toward the Democrats. By 2007, when all young people are millennials, the Democrats were 52 to 30. So in just a 3-year period, it looks like young people have changed totally. What has changed is the definition of young people. We have a new generation coming in, and that happens to be the millennial generation, and they are overwhelmingly Democratic. By 2008, again, the Democrats among millennials have a 2-to-1 lead. I can tell you from recent polling that hasn't changed. It's still a greater than almost a 2-to-1 advantage in party identification for the Democrats over the Republicans. What's important about that is once people formulate a party identification, they aren't likely to change it during the course of their lives. So you have this large generation that is going to go through life likely to be a Democratic generation. And just to give you, I'll give you a couple real quick figures. Most recent daily cost survey indicates that overall the public was 68% favorable, 27% unfavorable toward Obama. Among millennials, that is 83 to 12. So it's virtually unanimous. Looking at the Democratic Party, overall, the public was 55% favorable, 38% unfavorable toward the Democrats. Among millennials, it's 64-27. Looking on the other hand, the Republicans, overall, it was 29% favorable for the whole population, 66% unfavorable. Millennials, 12% favorable, 80% unfavorable. So there's hardly any millennial, seriously, who has anything good to say about the Republican Party right now. So that is speaking to what is likely to happen in the future, because the final chart I want to show you is where the millennial population is going to be in this country in the future. 2008, only 41% of millennials, with that huge Obama lead, only 41% of millennials were eligible to vote. Millennials made up only 17% of the total electorate or total population. By 2012, 61% of millennials can vote. That'll be 24% of the population. 2016, again, 80% of millennials can vote, 30% of the electorate. And by 2020, when there will only be one little age group, 17-year-olds who will still be millennials in that generation, will not be eligible to vote at that point. So 99% of the millennial generation will vote, and they will make up a third of the population. Again, if what is normal and what has happened historically with party identification, with voting behavior, as it has been with every other generation, the GI generation, for example, going through life, a large generation voting, having similar political identifications, similar political attitudes. And that is how we believe that the Democratic Party is likely to be the dominant force in American politics over the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. So I guess we will turn it over for questions at this point. Thank you.
And a lot of new slides and things, so thank you for
You're welcome.
that. It's great. And so, questions, anybody? And Tracy, people watching, can they ask questions? So if they're watching live, is there a way to click on to ask question on the site? Is that what it is? Okay, so it's questions at NDN. For those of you watching, NDN, questions at ndn.org. Send them in. Tracy will shepherd them over here. And also, just to do a plug, is that here's the book. You can buy it on Amazon. And
If you're online.
And if you're online, if you're here, you can buy and get an autograph copy.
There you go.
Here at the end of the event. So please stay with us. So have at it, everybody. Anybody got a question for Morley and Mike? Yes, ma'am.
Wait, you
need a mic. And just to remind everybody is that this is being recorded for in perpetuity, digitally for all time. So don't be good and don't make any mistakes. That's it. Yep.
The pressure.
Yeah.
Morley, one of the things you'd said in your presentation was that you anticipated mandatory national service. And I have to say that I find that somewhat contradictive to what we're talking about here in terms of the distributed kind of network, the distributed kind of involvement. So could you explain to us what you mean by that and what you envision?
Sure, it's a great question. Because it's going to be, in our opinion, an characteristic of many, many different policies, not just service. So the beginnings of it will be what we see now, a great expansion of those who want to participate, incentives to do so, a lot of enthusiasm for it, et cetera. At some point, people are going to say, wait a minute, look at all of us doing all this. Where's everybody else? I mean, come on, group, let's get together. This is a very group-oriented generation. And they're not going to be very appreciative of attempts to free ride, that everybody else is fixing the country and you're not. And so there'll be a great deal of peer pressure to make that happen. What civic generations tend to look to from a centralized governmental effort is the rule setting. So the rule will be, thou shalt do national service, in our opinion, at some point. And there will be rules about how to do it and, incentives for doing it. But how to do it won't be set by the national government. So all the current service organizations that are official in the federal government, those that may be aligned with it, like Teach for America, will all get drawn into, we don't care how you do your national service. This is not the draft, but thou shalt do it. And when thou shalt do it, we will help you with your education. And so the difference, it's like healthcare mandates. We actually think that individual mandates will be part of the healthcare outcome, not only because it makes sense from a policy perspective in terms of insurance rules, but also because it's a way of setting the standards for behavior, what it means to be a citizen in a civic era in America. Thou shalt have health insurance. We're not going to tell you which one to have. You're going to have lots of choice on how you do it, but what you have to do will be very clear. And it rolls through environmental policy and a whole raft of things as we go forward. Mike, you wanted to comment?
The only comment is just to emphasize a point that Morley made, and that is that it is going to sort of offer choice. He said it's not going to be the draft. In previous civic eras, that's what it was. That's what national service was, essentially, in World War II. And every able-bodied male, and some who probably weren't so able-bodied, were drafted into the military. And so this will offer a variety of different choices. And secondly is the reward on the back end. It is not simply going to be, we're going to extract your labor, but you will be rewarded, as was the case in the World War II era with the GI Bill. We will see similar kinds of help in providing education, which in the long run not only benefits those people, but obviously benefits society as well, because it will allow things to get done, and we will have a better educated workforce on the back end of this, as again was the case in the 1940s and 50s.
So next question is from one of our viewers. It's from Frank Davies, who chickened out and didn't brave the rain, and is watching it from his computer, our good friend Frank. San Jose Mercury News. So Frank's question is for Morley and Mike. Organizing for America is trying to mobilize Obama supporters starting this weekend to become an important part of the campaign to enact the ambitious Obama budget. How hard will it be for millennials and others in Obama's online army to make the transition from campaigning to influencing policy? Will the energy unleashed in the election translate? How will the energy unleashed in the election translate to the messy business of getting legislation passed?
So this will be one of the other great institutional transformations that America will undergo. And the focus of the transformation in this case will be the legislative branch and not the executive branch. The legislative branch is about to experience crowdsourcing as legislative policy making, and we've never seen that before. Organizing for America is a phenomenon in itself in terms of this new era, because it's an organized Netroots program directed centrally from Washington about Washington events. Our prediction would be it won't be nearly as exciting as a campaign, and therefore not have the levels of participation that Obama for America's Facebook page did in terms of mobilization. But compared to what existed before, which is zero, and the inability to do anything except artificial turf grassroots, this is going to be a considerable change. Simon and I have a little bit of historical baggage here, which we probably shouldn't talk about on video, but at the end of the 1992 campaign, the Clinton presidency faced the same question: what to do with the organization that had been put in place sort of over and separate from the political party. And the ultimate decision was to do nothing. And that was a very costly mistake by the president, as he learned in the next couple of years. This this ability to communicate and organize and mobilize on behalf of a cause, now a budget or a legislative proposal, be it healthcare, global warming, education reform, tax cuts, whatever it is, that's a very powerful weapon, and we're going to see it first used in this coming debate. And like everything else, when it starts, it won't be as powerful as it will be, but it will be transformational. It will be, okay, I know what the lobbyist in my office just told me, but I also know that there are 3,000 people in my district who seem to be upset about this issue. I better pay attention to that as well as what the guy in my office just told me.
And I just wanted to, again, reemphasize that point, that if you look at it from the perspective of the member of Congress who is getting that input from his or her constituents, it will be, I think, quantumly larger than they are used to seeing it. And so while it may not be where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years, from their perspective, it may be a lobbyist, it may be some organized group within their district or state, and they may have gotten a couple hundred responses or letters or phone calls or something of that sort. The fact that they're going to be getting thousands is much more than they're used to receiving. So I think it is going to be viewed in a very different way than they have been used to seeing things. And the ability, going back to the campaign, of young people to actually become engaged in the political process through the internet is remarkable. Their willingness, for example, to watch Senator Obama's speech over and over again on race relations in reference to Preacher Wright was incredible and involved millions of young people willing to go online.
So, to Simon's point, it's not youth politics, it's adult politics.
It's adult
done by
politics,
young people.
By young people who just happen to be a different young generation.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm Michael Nelson. I'm a professor of Internet Studies at Georgetown, and we study the impact of technology on society and how society is shaping technology. I'm particularly interested in the parts of your book where you look at the role of technology, and I'd be interested to hear a bit more about any analogies you can draw or differences you can draw between the Internet and this generation, the radio in the 1930s and newspapers in the 1860s. It seems to me that the Internet's been a much bigger factor here because it's used so differently by the different generations. The radio was something everybody listened to. Newspapers was something probably the older generation spent more time with. It seems that the internet and technology in general is a much more significant piece of the story this time around.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and Morley can speak to it in more detail, but I think that is definitely true. This is a generation that really understands not simply the internet, but even more specifically the social networking aspects of the internet, using that particular type of technology, almost to the exclusion of in many instances, of older generations.
The second part of that is it seems that technology is moving so fast that we're going to see some very important new developments well before the next generation.
Well, yeah, so it's actually an every 40-year phenomenon. We didn't talk about television and boomers, but that was, in an idealist era, it drove that kind of thing. The radio and television are both broadcast top-down, centrally controlled, limited bandwidth technologies, and as such, they reinforce the authority and ability of elites to control a discussion. The newspapers in Lincoln's days and the internet social networking in Obama's days do the opposite. They are very grassroots, people to people. I mean, yes, you did have to own a printing press, but it was the penny press. It was suddenly very cheap to be able to buy a newspaper and read it. So it was a hybrid of elite editorial decisions, but mass distribution. The internet eliminates even that piece of the ability of elites to influence public opinion. And, we see, obviously, newspapers shutting down or cutting back their coverage. You see Jay Leno taking over the 10 o'clock time slot on a major network, not just entertaining the president tonight, but all of that's a signal that the ability of people to watch and therefore provide advertising support for traditional media is fading away, and it will continue to fade at a very rapid clip in the next decade.
And just one last thing. The ability of using through the various portals on the internet of influence and of ways that individuals can access the internet is so much more complex than any of these other media. I mentioned about the SIP index. The complexity of trying to measure internet usage compared to television or radio usage is so infinitesimally greater. And I'm not sure that SIP is doing it as well as it can be done, but it's a great first effort. But it's so much more complex because of that ability of ways of people getting in to the process compared to the Nielsen television ratings, for example, which are kind of relatively straightforward compared to trying to measure something online.
I'll just throw in one thought, and is that, I talk a lot about the concept of a couch potato, which was the goal of marketing in the broadcast era was to think about this concept, right? It's going to be like those things you have to explain to your kids about what does it mean. Your job as a consumer was to sit on the couch and eat potato chips and change the channels and do nothing. It was not a participatory medium, and I think what's so interesting about this sort of confluence of need to get things done from a civically minded generation and a technology that is all about participation, right? I mean, I tell the story that there was a night I was watching a sporting event on Fox. This is the only time I watch Fox. Is that there were 3 consecutive commercials. One was for American Idol, which is a show you get to participate in. It's the most powerful show on television now. You get to determine the outcome of the event. The second was for a credit card that you could design on your own, and the third was for a car where you had the ability to design the car, right? So in 3 consecutive commercials, the brand was involving you in the choice of building the brand itself, and it was participatory, right? And getting to your question, this is the quantum leap. I mean, this is the huge paradigm shift from the broadcast era of political communications, which dominated everything we did here forever and ever. I mean, I think, and I predicted, and I was at an internet event recently, I got yelled at for saying what I'm about to say, is that for anyone who's in politics this cycle, get ready, because television as we know it will not exist by fall of 2010, right? Not fall of 2012, not fall of 2014, is that the broadcast television networks, which have been basically the receptacle for all of our money in politics for the last 40 years, essentially are going to be something else, by 18 months from now, based on current trend lines. They're admitting it themselves. And I think that, to your point, the velocity of change is increasing. I mean, when we were having these events 4 years ago, right after the last election, there was no Facebook and there was no YouTube, right? It's just kind of an amazing, or at least they weren't part of politics.
No, they weren't.
They weren't part of politics.
2005 is when they get
right.
created.
It wasn't part of politics anyway, right? So I think one of the interesting things is trying to imagine where we will be even 4 years from now in terms of the set of tools and how people are going to work. That innovation and staying ahead of the curve is become a prerequisite or a requirement for anybody involved in the political or advocacy business, which is one of the reasons why we have this affiliate called the New Politics Institute, which I would argue is one of the leading centers in the country really looking at how this media transformation is affecting advocacy and politics. A little plug for MPI, newpolitics.net. Next question, let me go to our online audience. We've gotten a lot of great questions, by the way. Thank you all back home. And this is from Nathan Naylor, an old friend. Question. Does the advent of the computer, this is a great question, does the advent of the computer between the last leap in communications technology, radio, mean that Moore's law might now be a factor in the timing of the next leap, i.e. the 80-year cycle being reduced to 40, and it happening faster?
So it actually happens every 40 years anyway. I mean, there's 2 kinds of realignments. They happen every 40 years. Each one is driven by a new kind of communication technology, television in the 60s. Our feeling is that the next significant technological change will not take place and be fairly visible until 2040, 2050, so in the next 40, 50-year time frame. And it's not going to be a new version of the internet or the latest Twitter fad. It's be more about the age of singularity when biological and electronics meld in a chip inside your brain, and then you have a different politics altogether. I'll just say one last thing on the
conversation.
Yeah, just one last thing on the television piece. If you don't believe television's ending, the most popular commercial on the Super Bowl was the 30 Rock commercial, in which the head of the supposed television activities at NBC explains that they're really aliens from another planet here to suck out your brains and make you, well, that's a very good takeoff on what couch potatoism was all about, right? But it's also the industry saying it's all over. It ain't going to work anymore. We can make fun of it.
Well, and in fact, that's an ad for an industry consortium to allow online viewing of television shows.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, that's what that ad was.
In answer also to that previous question, there is the second leg of these realignments too, and that's generational change.
Right.
And it may be that generations will become shorter in duration to some extent. Historically, at least according to Strauss and Howe, the earliest American generations were 27 or 28 years long. Now they're about 20. So that could shorten to some degree. But we still are going to have roughly that 20-year division where a generation is roughly 20 years, a birth generation is 20 years long. So I would still predict that the next realignment will be in 40 years, even with the technological change possible.
Let me go into the room, right? Is it the room's turn? Anybody here? Yes, sir, in the back.
Just in terms of governing after a realignment, what kinds of lessons do we take away from 1968 when you look at a president who, in retrospect, looks like he was ushering in a conservative age, but at the time was kind of governing more from the center and leaving behind a pretty liberal legacy?
Well, and we don't think the 68 analogy is a particularly useful one because it is a challenge of governing after an idealist realignment in which political institutions go out of favor, political parity is there and divisive, and so it's very difficult to govern. And so it kind of describes everything from Nixon through Clinton and even Bush in terms of trying to figure out how to govern. But in terms of the earlier civic realignments, the fundamental message is you have to have a very powerful vision. You have to enroll people in that vision, and you have to stick to it because most of the culture of the governing environment will be anti your ideas. Not just your party, not just the other party, but your party will be very suspicious and hesitant to change. And it's kind of the lesson of all change management consulting is that resistance comes immediately when you say we got to change. Everybody says why, and then they sit there and dare you to prove that we need to.
And I could also argue, too, that the 1968 realignment, or that particular idealist realignment, was not quite as complete in 68. It may have taken place in some stages, but I think we begin it at 68 partly because of the baby boomers coming of age, but partly because the basic Republican strategy of defending on social issues of the Southern strategy certainly was what Nixon ushered in, but maybe ideologically it might have occurred by around 1980, in the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan, and then the Republicans didn't take control of both elective branches until the 1990s. So it could have been a slower process, but I think the basic process did begin in 1968.
So a question from the internet, from Chris. Could you talk about the conventional wisdom that as people age, they become more conservative in their outlook, and how that relates to the current political preferences of millennials? Or is it that a generational viewpoint is relatively fixed, and that it's their position relative to successive less conservative generations that creates a perceived shift?
Chris's second statement is actually the correct one, that once a generation is put into existence, once its political viewpoint is formed, it generally holds that political viewpoint throughout the entirety of its life. The idea that somehow people start out as radical or liberal or on the left or however you want to define that, and then increasingly become conservative as they age is in fact not the case. People either start out as liberal or conservative, and they stay that way throughout the entirety of their lives.
They start out that way in the sense of their young adulthood decisions about how the world works.
Right.
And so one of the keys in the current history we're living through is that having made this decision in 2008, if it's confirmed in the voter's mind in 2012, it's a lifetime.
Right. And so, but for another generation, in the early 1980s, the Generation X came into the electorate, liked Ronald Reagan, stuck with Ronald Reagan and Reagan-esque ideas pretty much throughout the entirety of their lives. So they started, but the important point is they started quote-unquote conservative, and they remained that way throughout the entirety of their lives. And on the other hand, the last civic generation, the GI generation back in the 1930s, started as Roosevelt Democrats and were voting as Roosevelt Democrats. The only two generations in 2004 that gave John Kerry a majority support were the very first millennials who were voting and the very last GIs who were voting as they were going out of the political process.
Maybe we'll take one more. Yes, ma'am. Welcome.
This is actually kind of an appropriate follow-up. As the millennials grow, both in political influence, by voting, by becoming thought leaders, by becoming political leaders, and we're saying that their personalities are more collaborative and searching for win-win, I wonder what you think that means for bipartisanship and the divisiveness between the parties.
So President Obama called for a new tone in politics that was more of a civil discourse, and that's obviously something that millennials would relate to. They didn't like Sarah Palin. They thought she was rude. She had the highest degree of unpopularity long before everybody decided she was not ready for prime time, was among millennials because of the nasty things she said about community organizing, for instance. The world is not a community and it doesn't need an organizer. Most millennials say, no, actually it's the other way around. So just the tone is important. But in terms of partisanship, we talk in the book about something we call positive partisanship, which is the assertion of your party's political philosophy, which Lincoln and FDR were very good at, without being nasty about it, and by willing to listen to the other side. And so there was this great, subsequent to the book obviously, a great dialogue in one of the summits that the Obama administration did. I think it was the first one on fiscal sustainability. They had all the leaders together to talk about budgets and deficits and so forth. And the Republican was making the argument at the end that Obama ought to tell Pelosi to be more inclusive in her approach, right? And the president sort of remembered that there was a speaker and there was a president. There were two separate branches. We have a constitution. And he said, well, I'm not going to get too deep into congressional politics, but I do believe the Democrats have an obligation to be inclusive, except the other side, the minority side, has an obligation to be constructive. And that's a pretty good definition of civic era partisanship. We get to announce what we think because we won, and quote the president. You get to say what your ideas are, so long as your ideas are not blow it up, do nothing. If you have ideas, we'll listen to those. That's what we're going to call, quote, bipartisanship. And it is not going to be some kind of, third-way triangulation, split the baby, take some of their bad ideas, some of our good ideas, put them together. That's not civic era working together kind of attitudes from millennials. It's, we all believe this. Do you want to join the group? And if so, what can you contribute?
No, I think Morley said it pretty well.
I do think that Obama has to get a little bit better about saying, I love the sinner but hate the sin. Meaning that when I've studied FDR, one of the things I admired the most about him was that he ran against Herbert Hoover for 12 years. And in every speech that he ever gave, he started with evoking this sort of straw man of the conservatives who had ruined the country to remind us why it was important for us to not go back to a set of failed and bad ideas that did so much damage to the country. And I think actually Barack has got to get much tougher, not on the Republicans, but on failed, dangerous ideas that have done so much harm to the national interest. And finding that right balance, I think, is going to be hard. And frankly, it's, as Morley said, it's the inverse of bipartisanship, right? I mean, it's the opposite of bipartisanship. And it's why I think the concept of the third way is anachronistic. I mean, I think that, and I was an advocate in the 90s of people coming together to solve common problems. The prerequisite for that theory is that reasonable people can come together from both sides and sort of fix things. That assumes the other side is reasonable. And the problem the country has had, and this has been part of the problem the media has had, right, which is that the he said, she said media, is the Republican Party has been a destructive, unreasonable, dangerous force in American life for the last 8 years. That's not the way it's always been. We talked about Lincoln, right, who was probably our greatest president of our other party, but certainly someone who I have tremendous personal admiration for, right? It doesn't mean that it is always that way. But we have to be clear, I think, with calling out ideas and strategies and to not make allowances, I think, as Morley said, just because, right? Is that if they're good ideas, they get to come to the table. If they're constructive, and the challenge for the Republican Party, and I think you're seeing this, I mean, I've written a series of essays called The Long Road Back, right, is that I think the Republicans are more out of touch with the American people and more out of touch with American politics since they've been since the 1930s. I mean,
This polling data would suggest forever.
yeah, and I think that part of the challenge we have, and part of Barack's challenge, is the way that he dealt with Eric Cantor that day also, where he said, hey, Eric, I know there's some day when we're going to agree on something. And he kind of made fun of Cantor for, frankly, being such an asshole, right? I mean, we should just have to say it, right? We have to be comfortable by saying that these guys suck. They've done incredible damage to the country. Barack is being wildly more respectful of them, I think, than they frankly deserve, given what the ditch that they've dug us all in. But that's his choice. But I think we've got to find language to condemn the sin while loving the sinner. And I think he's doing a better job, and frankly, I'm not very good at it either, but I mean, this is a hugely important task, because what is the worst possible outcome of the next few years is adopting, in order to get along and go along and to bring them along, is to accept bad ideas, like the AMT fix that happened in the stimulus, right, which was unnecessary, non-stimulative, and required, in order to get that thing through, completely inconsistent with everything that Barack was arguing. And I think this is going to become a really important thing to watch, I think, as we go forward, about what is the limit of what he's willing to accept, and when is he going to draw the line. And my instinct is that as he gets, he's only been there for 6 weeks, and as soon as he figures out where all the bathrooms are and everything else in the next few months, he's going to draw this line, I think, much tougher than he has in the early days, because the country requires him to do so. It is actually in the national interest of the country to do so, which is a very different kind of politics than we pursued in the 1990s.
Right. Let me just add one thing to kind of go along with that. We are in a different era. We are in an era of crisis. In the 1990s, really starting in the 1980s, people didn't like government. They didn't trust government. They thought government would only do bad things, essentially. So you wanted divided government, because that way nothing would happen, and we would keep on doing the same things. With the crisis situation we're in right now, people want government to act. They need governmental activity to resolve these crises, and I think the American public, we've seen it in the poll data that Morley showed, recognizes that the only way this can happen is to have partisanship of some degree, where one party controls both elected branches and accomplishes things. Yes, respectfully works as much as they can with the opposition party, but if the opposition party fails to work back, they've got to go ahead and they've got to resolve the problems that are facing the country.
We've got to wrap up. Do you guys closing thoughts, closing words? Buy the book?
Buy the book, yeah.
Just a quick final note, and first of all, buy the book, and it's a great one, and if you haven't had a chance, please do. And you can buy multiple copies as well and give them to your friends. Amazon's an amazing thing. And second of all, we have just quick announcement, we've got 2 events in the next couple of weeks. Next week, we'll be doing an event looking ahead as a preview of the Summit of the Americas, and it's a star-studded event with Senator Bob Menendez, the Foreign Minister of Panama, many ambassadors, Latin American ambassadors. Andres and Zaraya, our team, have done a phenomenal job of putting together what I think will be a don't-miss event. It will also be live webcast. It's from the new Visitors Center in the Capitol, so if you haven't been there yet, you get a chance to cut the lines a little bit and get through. And then also we'll be doing, the week after, an event looking ahead at the G20 Summit with Rob Shapiro and others, and look for that online. But thanks everybody very much. Thanks.